able to join us today. He has some other engagements too.
Oh, no issues, no issues. Yeah. Okay. So.
So is this the, you guys are the faculty panel who are responsible for organizing the sessions? Dr. Shipra?
Yeah.
Dr. Ashish?
Yeah.
Is it Dr. Bing?
Yeah, they all are, faculty members from Ramanujan College from different departments.
Oh, great.
So they are part of this teaching learning center, which conduct these faculty development programs and induction program and other sort of workshops. In fact, I would want to share that, Ramanujan College was amongst the one, to take lead in the country, even during the pandemic times. They are the ones who have been training thousands of, faculty members from across the country. And indeed, I believe that people from other countries have also been joining. So this is a very, very, known team in India, which is behind, meaningful, work that they've been doing in the times of pandemic. And indeed, I think, I as a sociologist see that also, coming out from the idea of, thinking of community engagement. I mean, so they've been able to engage the whole academia with very, very enriching programs and during the times when it was needed the most. And otherwise also, like, it's been quite some time and for so many years they've been doing it. So shall we, I think it's time and we can begin. Can we just, yeah, so can we go ahead, Professor Rathi?
Yeah, we can.
We are live, yeah.
We are
Okay.
live.
So a very, very warm welcome to all of you. Good morning, and good morning from India, and a very warm good evening from Alaska, as we have Professor David Moxley joining us from there. And indeed, it is a matter of pleasure that we could have him here for this live series of lectures of Faculty Induction Program 6 and Faculty Development Program, on blended learning, the alternative dimensions, 2 weeks workshop that began yesterday. So, well, I extend a very hearty welcome to all of you on behalf of Teaching Learning Center of Ramanujan College, Delhi University, also on the behalf of principal of Ramanujan College, and who is also the director of the center, and on the behalf of program directors of both the programs. And well, with that, the theme for the session today is something which, each one of us can relate to, is faculty investment in civic engagement with local communities. And I think we've never felt, this sort of a need of, engaging with the idea of community engagement and civic engagement, the more, we are wanting at this point of time. However, at the same time, when we also talk about blended learning, we must, recognize the fact that the idea of blended learning, is embedded in the very idea of well-being, or for that matter, civic engagement also emerges from this very idea of well-being, which helps us in, bringing forth a very meaningful engagement. And as an academic, we all could contribute in wonderful ways, not only to our learners who are coming to us, but also to the communities, to the social context of the learners, who are coming to us from diversely located contexts. So, well, with that, let me take this golden opportunity to introduce Professor Moxley to all of you. Professor Moxley is a professor in the University of Alaska, Anchorage, and he is director of School of Social Work and also serves as director of School of Human Services and the National Resource Center for Alaska Native Elders. He has undertaken considerable work in civic engagement through partnerships, uniting local communities and campuses in advancing local quality of life, experiential education of students, technology diffusion, innovation uptake, and faculty development. So we are very, very glad that you could spend your precious time for us. And thank you so much. And over to you for your delegation, please.
Thank you, Dr. Tokas. I am thrilled to be with you. We are so far apart, but through the magic of technology, we are closer together. We are separated by 14 hours, 14 and a half hours. But it seems like with each visit I make to India, I feel closer and closer to what is happening, particularly in higher education, and what is happening in higher education in the United States, and really globally. It's fantastic that as a faculty, no matter what our backgrounds are, or our disciplines, we are united in real ways and in potential ways as a global community, who in a sense speak the same language. The language of illumination, the language of enlightenment, the language of discovery, the language of fabrication, the language of explanation, prediction. It's all a very exciting time, even though we've been through quite a stressful time, to start thinking about the post-COVID community that we will all be returning to. My guess is that more than ever, people will be hungry for social interaction, mutuality, social support, and perhaps we won't take things as much for granted as we have in the past, as we enter a new normal that's going to demand that we rebuild institutions, that we, if I could use the English verb, knit together communities. And my faith is in the community of scholars that are in many ways reaching out to communities virtually and physically, although the difference is getting a little bit narrower. And so in anticipation of our re-entry, maybe we could start considering the reframing of what we would consider to be civic engagement and civic engagement in higher education. I'm hoping that nothing comes as a surprise for us this evening, because many of us are working in local communities, are preparing students for local communities, are interacting with groups, and thinking about the nature of our scholarly work in forging engagement. My experience is in civic engagement with groups that not only are living in poverty, but groups that are highly marginalized. And there is a reason for that, as I'll suggest as we go on in the evening. A couple ground rules. Ask questions anytime. Dr. Tokas will share those questions with me, or you can send them to me directly in the chat. And I am excited about responding to those questions as they, in a sense, roll in, as they come in. So let me begin with this very simple slide that says faculty investment in civic engagement. One of the things I would like to underscore that maybe there are two ways of approaching civic engagement from a standpoint of scholarship. One is the institution encourages us to do that. It builds structures for doing that. It brings faculty into those structures to make contributions in areas that the university community has decided is important. And then the other approach is the faculty member himself, the faculty investment in civic engagement is largely a choice made by the faculty member. And over the course of my own engagement in civic engagement, I've come to appreciate the many gifts that faculty members can bring in an ethos that's framed in well-being, as Dr. Tokas had begun our session with, the idea of well-being. And I think that notion of well-being is grounded in communities that are, and this is what we're learning and have learned, that are resilient, that are inventive, creative, and those capacities may even gain more traction as faculty members bring those similar gifts into a given community. So as we are progressing this evening, or this morning, it's evening for me, I apologize, for this morning for you all, faculty engagement is, or faculty investment is consistent with the notion that it is up to us. It's up to us to find meaning in engagement, to connect with groups and people who maybe we'd otherwise not interact with, and to engage in a very curious way that, you know, we would call civic. And civic suggests to me the politics, the commerce, the interactions within institutional life within a given community, and helping communities build their own institutions, if indeed they are separated from society without the kind of let's say, benefits that accrue to most groups, or many groups, I should say. Dr. Tokas, are my slides showing? Good, okay. So my idea, it's not a radical idea, but it's one, and the slides I present to you, the information I'm presenting to you is part from literature, but mostly from my own practice and my own experience. So if you disagree, fine, and please share your sense of differences with me. I value that. It's a source of learning for myself. So the idea of civic engagement in higher education for me is a process of helping groups build assets. And given my first statement that faculty involvement is very much voluntary, it is really up to faculty on their own, or in groups, or in academic units, to make decisions about releasing their own assets to a given community. And that requires us to be mindful of what we do possess, because as faculty members, all of us possess an enormous scope of assets that we actually may take for granted. And one of the good places to start, a meaningful place to start, particularly with colleagues, is sort of this discussion of what assets we have individually, but maybe more importantly, collectively, and in a small group kind of context, that could be meaningfully released to other communities to enhance their quality of life, which is just another term for what Dr. Tokas referred to as well-being. In my socialization as a psychologist and in the social sciences and social work, I believe in the term eudaimonia, which is the Greek term for well-being. But it's a different kind of well-being. It's sort of like a welling up of well-being. And usually attached to that is an empathy and a sympathetic regard for how people other than us may need things that we could offer. Not offer in a contractual kind of way, but offer in a way of discovery that joins us to build mutual knowledge. Last night, I had a fantastic interaction with a student who is a biologist and a dance major. And I was trying to figure out with her how she put those two things together. And she told me a long story about how a faculty member from a dance studio in a university came to her school with colleagues and taught her about body geometry and the biology of body geometry in the human condition. And obviously that stuck with her. And she told me, like any promising new upcoming scholar, she said, there's so much I can share with people about the intersection between biology and dance. And of course, culture is present, and social organization is present, and literacy is present. And so this idea of blending sticks with us now because we're realizing that knowledge is more complex than we know it is from just our discipline, even though our disciplines are very, very important. So the idea of creating assets for me is one of the most exciting aspects of civic engagement. As I'll suggest in other slides, that we can look at conditions and see their transformational possibilities in working with communities that want to engage that transformation. Because in previous talks, we've dealt with, the idea of cultural diffusion and the diffusion of technology. And what I'm not trying to argue for is a pressing of our perspectives onto a given community, but to find a, what could I call it? If I have to use the term contract, I would call it the contract of faith in wanting to do something mutually that will better our world. And there are so many practical examples. Educating our children, supporting households with elders, facilitating the interaction between groups that would otherwise not interact. Maybe a very significant one, finding how to manage water, how to engage in sustainable horticulture, let's say at a community level, how to co-produce food, how to create nutrition, how to build different transportation alternatives, how to have fun, how to produce entertainment. And I don't want to sound like I'm overusing the term production, but the idea of social production is quite useful to us when we think about the creation of assets. And I should have said in this slide, in partnerships, with partnerships between ourselves, our institutions, and people who groups who want to collaborate with us. And I can't underscore enough the idea of release, because if civic engagement is voluntary, it would be up to us to be able to want to release our great assets to communities who benefit from us, and we benefit from them. And that mutual benefit is so very, very important in the co-creation of assets. And I'll show you what some of those assets can be as we move along. I do want to just sort of touch base on the rationale for civic engagement, just briefly. There's a strong professional thrust to motivation to share our knowledge. It's probably very prominent in universities because we receive public support. And there is, in a sense, that as professionals, we are privileged. I know I am. It's a privilege to be able to delve in to a scholarly area and deepen my own understanding. And I sort of am, as a professional, wanting people to realize that their monetary investment is a good one, that I care about public life, that I care about the quality of life of communities, that I care about the well-being of various groups in a given community. So it is very interesting that Dr. Tokas uses the term well-being, and it's in the first bullet point under professional, the role of the professoriate in improving well-being, particularly of vulnerable groups. And that's more important than ever. And that has been accentuated by COVID. We know that there were vulnerable groups before COVID whose members became even more vulnerable because of the virus and because of the pandemic, and even the response to the pandemic. And many people disagree with me about this, but I do feel public-facing universities, those who are supported by the public dollar and the public treasure, have an ethical responsibility to invest in community life. And fortunately, each of us can define that in a manner that actuates our values and helps us further the power of our discipline, which would be the disciplinary rationale. Are disciplines disappearing? No, but they're blending. And they're blending in very curious kind of ways that I would call solution-focused ways, that we're looking for solutions that can better ourselves, our communities. So well-being goes hand in hand, from my perspective, with human betterment, which is a fundamental issue we have to engage more so than ever in democracy, to make democracy work, and to counter, let's say, fascism in a given context. So beyond knowledge creation per se, we have these very interesting kind of quasi-disciplines emerging around translation, dissemination, utilization, and then what we would call value engineering, being able to take our knowledge and engineer it so it has use in a given kind of context. And what surprises me about myself recently is I'm getting less interested in academic publication. And I'm getting more interested in dissemination to publics that I feel could benefit from the knowledge we have as products of our research. Dr. Tokas mentioned that I am responsible for the National Resource Center for Alaska Native Elders. And it always amazes me, I do not look like an Alaska Native elder, nor am I may be an elder, but I'm not Alaska Native. But I've learned so much about oral traditions from Alaska Native elders. And we've been able to encapsulate that into dissemination products around nutrition and food and what's called traditional foods in Alaska, so that people have more usable knowledge than, let's say, I were to send them a paper on nutrition from a outstanding journal, which has its own value in and of itself. But we begin to think in dissemination and translation, how we are going to get knowledge in the hands of people who would potentially want to use it. And I have to recognize that that kind of work is not yet within the metrics of academic evaluation. We know the importance of publication. We know the importance of grants. We know the importance of funded research. We know the importance of citation of our work, but we don't have any real clear measures around what is the impact of a dissemination effort that gets knowledge in the hands of people who would want to use it, who don't have the standing as scholars. And of course, that sort of invents the idea, the concept of the public-facing professor, which is getting more and more currency. I'm not sure if it is in India. I know it is. It's getting currency in the United States and Canada. And I'm not saying we're on the cutting edge of this, but you're seeing more and more appointments around professors of practice, professors of civic engagement, professors of public service. And that's a real turn in higher education. And from my standpoint, it is a turn toward a relevance that has not necessarily been present in the past. And then, of course, we get into pedagogy. The idea of bringing our students into situations of problem solving that they'd otherwise not get an opportunity to do. This got me thinking about my own doctoral program, where I spent 60% of my time in communities applying knowledge to improve the lives of children with disabilities, cognitive or physical, emotional, kinds of conditions we refer to as disability. And I was puzzled by one thing, and this sort of encapsulates my enthusiasm about civic engagement. The more we equipped teachers and parents and children and grandparents with knowledge that could improve the well-being of their children, the less disabled their children appeared. And I was always fascinated with how resourceful we were getting in problem solving or solution-focused kind of work. It could be a single child, maybe a child with autism, or it could be a whole group of children in a particular school system, or it could have been a whole group of children within a region. For me, that's a scaling kind of decision, but they're all equally important. They have all equal standing in terms of civic engagement. It is possible, therefore, to blend the professional, the disciplinary, and the pedagogical rationale into an effort to invest, each of us making the investment in one another and in our communities to bring about the potential of awesome well-being. And then let me finish the rationale around the institutional thrust. The idea of the university as a public citizen, institutionally, that is grappling, like any institution, with what is the right thing to do at the given moment, and caring for and about the people it intends to help, or wants to help, or needs to help, or legally must help. And then this societal rationale, which I think is very important, as we all socialize and re-socialize ourselves into an ethic of mutuality, an ethic of exchange, an ethic of mutual support. And then the seeping out of all this in a transnational kind of context. You think about, or I think about the university as a public citizen. I can also think of it as a global public citizen. And many of us are embedded in transnational networks. My colleague and I have done a lot of work in forced migration and transnational forced migration. And you get forced migration when you get weak institutions that don't have the sustaining power to sort of hold their citizens in place and provide and offer opportunities that facilitates their progression. And one of the greatest opportunity structures, as we all know, is education. I cannot tell you how many contexts I've been in from a civic engagement standpoint and a research standpoint when you ask families, parents, elders, and children, what do you want for yourselves? They always talk about education. They don't necessarily mean but what they mean by education is not necessarily what I mean. So it creates a nice dialogue around what that is, because for some grandparents I found they are speaking to like traditional education. What they felt the knowledge base, particularly let's say from a folk knowledge base, they'd want their children to hold on to as they get professionally educated, which their parents and grandparents want them to. And technical education, and very often ethical education. And the other day I was visiting a school where the first level is traditional folk knowledge. The second level is the traditional academy. The third level is vocational education for all the children, no matter what their academic interests are or their academic strengths are. And then the top level was committed to civic engagement as a planning center for creative ideas and creative knowledge, group level knowledge building. And it was very interesting that those ideas could filter down the levels of the school and right out the door into the immediate community. So the kids were testing what they referred to, and our engineering or pharmaceutical colleagues will like this word, prototypes. Small microcosms of solutions they could try to test out. And you know, the children are automatically engaged in science by virtue of that. But they're also engaged in humanities by virtue of the folk knowledge they have. And that's an integrative structure, what maybe Dr. Tokas would refer to as a blended kind of approach. We can blend in so many different ways to get to the whole person, the whole community, maybe even the whole nation or a whole society. And you know, and maybe the emotional basis of civic engagement, no matter how well educated all of us are, is humility and cultural humility, of being able to say, I don't know, and look to people who we would otherwise not see as teachers, who we know hold powerful forms of knowledge that we would want them to release. And the releasing is an attitudinal structure that says, I want Dr. Tokas to have my knowledge. I want her to use it. I want her to understand it. And then we get into this rhythm of exchange, typically dialogic. In the social distance, which is an apt term right now in COVID, the social distance begins to shrink and we start having conversations we'd never had before. And those conversations, when we go back to quality of life and well-being, are embedded in the most powerful thing I feel we can do from a civic engagement standpoint. And that is help communities create the narratives that they feel are wonderful for themselves. And you know, those are not exotic things. They typically come down to food and its quality, children and their well-being, elders and their support, interactions and socialization, and being able to create a living that produces a standard of living that is really very much part of well-being. So when I walk around and think about civic engagement, I'm always thinking about what is the quality of the environment in which we are engaged. Because the quality of the environment and its carrying capacity and its sustainability is so important to human life, as we all know. And standard of living, I feel, sits on top of that quality of environment. And quality of day sits on top of standard of living. And quality of life is stacked on quality of day. So we sort of have this structure that says we have to advance all of these components or domains, typically one project at a time. And I'll tell you toward the end of my presentation why the project is so important in terms of faculty investment. The implications for us, and I would ask all of us to sort of think about this when we step back and we look at what we do. And I think we all will be amazed when we take time to do this and ask, what is the impact of our work? What is our impact on the challenging issues that communities face and the issues that our students bring into higher education from the communities in which they are from or in which they reside? That impact factor sort of shifts from, what is embedded, let's say, within a scholarly paper. Although I have to say, I get awfully excited with scholarly papers. I love writing them. I love working on them with colleagues. But then I have to step back and ask, well, what does this mean in not a utilitarian way, but more in a pragmatic way in terms of how does it touch people's lives? And we're seeing a shift, I believe, in institutions of higher education where our relevance is and we don't have really good metrics for this. Our relevance is founded on how we improve well-being. That is going to be up to another generation to generate those kinds of metrics. But I do a lot of reviews in the United States and other countries for tenure. And I'm always amazed at what faculty do of incredible levels of impact. One recently, rather than submitting a narrative, a faculty member submitted a photographic essay. And she showed how there was this empty field in Alaska. And going through steps, and she is a documentarian, and she got photographs of all the steps culminating in this new kind of living arrangement for people with serious mental illness that would support their inclusion and participation in community. And the remarkable thing is that all the people who were living in that new entity that was linked to a school were once homeless. And for Alaska, it took her 6 years to build that prototype. And then the very interesting thing, the last slide was in quadrants. I wish I could show it to you. If I come back, I visit again, I'll get this photographic essay if I can. The last one, the last slide, were 4 new apartment or these new structures that other communities around Juneau have created and emulating what this faculty member had done. And I just remember saying to myself how not only skilled she is as a researcher, but how skilled she is in engagement and being able to bring the bottom up, or what I would refer to in social change language as bootstrapping this from almost nothing. And her narrative is the alignment of her work with helping people remove themselves from homelessness, which is a big issue in the United States. It's hard to explain why we have so much homelessness, although it's easy to figure out. Some other implications. The words I use here are precious words to me because they represent a new way of doing scholarly work that is contained in the past in very interesting kind of ways, but have been culminating around what is the social meaning of the work and the practice we engage in. Dissemination science is something I had mentioned. Implementation science is yet another trend. Utilization-focused science, you begin to see the idea of utilization in a lot of different fields. Translatory science. Now notice science is linked to all of these terms for a special reason, because it deserves understanding, exploration, prediction, and explanation. So we're applying the phrase science to the advancement of utilization of knowledge. And if I were to go to the last phrase, the ontologies within knowledge management, meaning that we're getting increasingly savvy. We have increasing savvy with organizing knowledge within a given solution-focused field. Like that faculty member who is now developing housing options for people who were once homeless. Practice-focused knowledge, the legitimization of the professor of practice, the public service professor, the reemergence of action research, which I feel is very exciting, which is professionals asking questions of their own practice in relationship to knowledge building that links to solutions. You find it increasingly more in nursing, in engineering, in medicine, I have a colleague who does a lot of action research in toxicology because he thinks of himself as a physician of sorts. And he engages communities in around healing their soil. And he has a methodology to heal soil when it's been contaminated with heavy metals. And what's happened, and this is in Detroit, Michigan, where the old factories contaminated the soil and then left town. And now Detroit, Michigan is the #1 city in the United States with urban agronomy, urban agriculture. And it's because now folks are using this, groups are using this methodology to heal the soil. Heal the soil. Collaborative-based teamwork. It's hard to do civic engagement on our own. It gets very exciting as we're able to create synergies in a transdisciplinary way that is, let's do X in partnership with Y and bring about Z, because the more motivated colleagues we have in one place, the more we know. The more we know. Interinstitutional collaboration, informatics. Informatics is becoming more and more important, particularly in creating narratives, in helping communities use the knowledge they have and being able to form a narrative of plight. I call it the narrative of plight. That's what they're up against. That's what they're trying to do to improve their well-being. That's what they may be overwhelmed by, leading into a narrative of resilience, to build the resiliencies to offset that plight. And oftentimes we're the connector, we being self-appointed professors of public practice. And then of course these ontologies. And I bring these under a transdisciplinary approach because of this idea that we're blending. And in some areas it will be called folding. So I'll use the term threefolding tonight, threefolding. We fold together our science/research scholarship with instruction and pedagogy or andragogy and service, such that you can't really pinpoint, each one of those. They're so well blended in let's say a community-based project like preserving housing, the conversion of, let's say, a building into that kind of school I described with 4 tiers, with the top tier being the center of creativity so they could push this content down and out the door into community solutions, led by teachers in partnership with parents and partnership with faculty from the local university, all being on the same page about co-creation. And remember, we all know that creation comes out of imagination. And imagination, the root of imagination is image. If we can visualize it, we can begin to look at it in a way that we could actually make it happen. Even though we may bump our heads against, some impasses, but the exciting thing is we could make this happen. And then that example of the school, what becomes really formative, what becomes really critical is not only the building and the pedagogy, but the number of kids who come from that kind of culture of education, where they are fearless in being able to confront challenges with their imagination. And universities are just full of imagination. We need imagination, or the testimony to the imagination are the labs, the projects, the classrooms, the activities, the events, the celebrations that occur in the community building on a given campus. And then being able to extend that out into other communities is a powerful form of imagination, of possibilities and of potential. And then the public facing implications, we hear a lot about CBPAR, community-based participatory action research. We get it confused with community-based research. Community-based research occurs when we study people who allow us to study them. Community-based participatory action research is when we join together to find solutions to improve well-being as people in the community or in the group define it. That's very important. So it's not unusual that one would spend a lot of time framing that kind of sense of well-being and being able to join faculty resources with that, so that faculty have an opportunity to release what they have as assets, because within that frame is likely a new community asset. We hear a lot about citizen science nowadays. It's a huge movement that's gaining considerable capacity as well-educated people, let's say, in our, I'm familiar with it in Canada, in the United States, want to be part of in their own communities, become part of the science enterprise in blending basic research aims of producing knowledge and understanding and gaining insight, and those public service aims of trying to preserve, let's say, a watershed or particular animal life, or reaching out to, in the example I gave of Juneau, Alaska, people who are homeless, and imagining new housing options in partnership with formerly homeless people. And then I'll make, the idea that local communities are laboratories. I'm a little ambivalent about that because it suggests to me that we're acting on that particular community in an objectified way. But I've talked to a lot of community members who've said, yeah, let's use us as a laboratory. We want to find solutions, and people can potentially emulate what we're trying to do. And then the idea of the qualities, I use that very seriously when I think of quality of environment, quality of day, quality of life. Those are the qualities that I want to be able to help communities bring about. So let's pause. Are there any questions we want to raise?
Yeah, there are a couple of questions. One is, I believe, has been put across, more so in the past few months that we witnessed, is about how can we achieve, effective civic engagements in the face of weak institutions which are subject to forced migrations. So that's one. And there are a couple of more questions. So you would want me to take them together, or perhaps, because the other one is a little different. And yeah, and there's another question which by Dr. Tiwari, who says that most of teachers who belong to this academic fraternity do have the desire to give back what they have gained from society, but there are many obstacles, lack of motivation being the greatest. So yeah, so these are a couple of questions, and this third one, so we can take the third question once you address these two concerns.
Well, excuse me. I have a colleague who travels with migrants, and she creates what she calls temporary institutions to support their transit. And this colleague of mine is Asian, and she's worked with a number of groups, and she, in a sense, helps them create these temporary institutions, and she knows where they're going. She's worked with the United States government to help people resettle in Dallas, Texas. And those institutions followed them. And then they, in a sense, they're sort of portable kinds of institutions, and one of which is, and I'm using institution now not in a transnational kind of way or trans-societal kind of way. I'm using it as an intimate kind of institution that has resilience and permanency that people can count on. And the purpose of this particular institution that she's been developing has to do with helping people transit successfully. Unfortunately, she can't help them during the process of departure. That has its own dynamics, and some of it has its own sadness. But during the transit experience, which can last a long time, in getting to a destination like Dallas, Texas, and being able to form this one model that facilitates people's, that helps people preserve, particularly women, preserve their culture of origin, where they came from, which is, in this case, she's been working a lot with people from Myanmar, or what was referred to as Burma, which is a neighbor of India. And then into Dallas, where there's and this is a paradox, the preservation of culture and the accommodation of the new culture, which is so very stressful, that those two things together. And she has facilitated something dear in Indian social welfare, which is microenterprises, out of that kind of structure to begin to help women build structures in their daily lives that facilitate the success of their families. And for them, for the women, the migrant women, institutional life has been unpredictable, and it, in some ways, has been a threat to their well-being and their actual lives. And unstable institutions are creating all sorts of migrant populations around the world, including the United States internally. And I often wonder if Chloe can scale this up, what kind of world we would be seeing around migrant well-being. But then her and I always have conversations around the very root issue, and that is, why do you have to leave? And what is the nature of those institutions? Having higher education engage that kind of issue comes at, that can be very threatening in an unstable country, let's say, that views that as, let's say, dissent, or as unwanted kind of action on part of professors and groups. And this sounds a little naive on my part, but I am naive, so I'll live with it. And that is the notion that we are constant, and the power of the professoriate is we can invent. It's an amazing capacity. And of course, that's somehow linked to creativity and imagination the idea of invention. And the idea of a social invention is getting even more roots in helping people do things they want to do, they otherwise don't have the, let's say, the support. I almost said the capacity. They have the capacity. They don't have the support to necessarily bring it about. So I do have a great deal of empathy about the idea of unstable institutions, rigid institutions, dysfunctional institutions, but I have also a lot of faith in alternative institutions, that when mainstream institutions don't work, we're so inventive, we can invent new ones that work, that honor, let's say, differences among us, that honors people emerging from marginalized status, like, let's say, women, people who are building identity around their sexual orientation, people who are returning, let's say, from war or combat, veterans, who want to build their own intentional communities. That inventiveness is part of the professoriate. And I feel it's a very promising aspect of civic engagement. Now, if I could leapfrog over to that question about barriers. So I'm going to say another naive thing. I believe it. When we do civic engagement, we're creating cases of some instance of something, like educating children or creating an architecture that supports people with homelessness and who were homeless and have disabilities. So the recognition of the barriers is a form of knowledge. And it's part of the documentary base of what we do. We should understand those barriers. We should understand the facilitators of helping us get over the barriers, under the barriers, around the barriers, but hardly every time through the barriers. But bringing those barriers systematically into consciousness of a group that's trying to do something is very important. Figuring out how to resolve those barriers or weaken those barriers is yet another form of knowledge. And it adds to what I would call civic know-how. And civic know-how is a form of knowledge that helps us get to the common good. Another term that we could use for well-being in a little bit different kind of way, the common good. And then I would call the kind of action we're testing as breakthrough action. Do we break through those barriers that get us, that are frustrating us or preventing us, or that would otherwise where we would lose motivation? And the other aspect of the professoriate and faculty that I admire to no end is that barriers are typically, in science, are seen as impasses. There are things that are to be resolved in the process of producing knowledge, let's say in the laboratory. Well, in the new laboratory, let's say in a community, those barriers are impasses we can experiment with and we can find solutions to that add to the civic engagement case of one's professional record. And I don't like coercive motivation. I like effectance motivation. And effectance motivation is the kind of motivation that people find the effects they're having on their environment are so rewarding, they get even more motivated to do something. And we often think of motivation as coercive. We have to coerce people into doing something. But here's the other thing I admire about professors, the professoriate, is they tend toward autotelic behavior. And autotelic behavior is we get motivated by learning. The other aspect of that is autodidactic behavior. We're self-taught. And all of us who've been through doctoral programs know what I mean. That at a certain point, it's up to you and your colleagues to take knowledge the next step in commerce with let's say seminar or symposium or colloquium or the laboratory or the performance or the creation of art. And the pedagogy really turns into an andragogy, the education of adults, takes on a different kind of flavor in terms of being able to sustain something. And if I come back to civic engagement as a community lab, it's so important. And part of the motivating features of a good project is we bring in our graduate students. We bring in our talented undergraduate students. They'll help us get over the barriers. And there's some barriers that are harder to get over than others, like a no from an official. Or you can't do that. Or you better not do that. Those are different kinds of barriers having to do with influence, I believe, and of course the politics of knowledge. But I tend to stand back and I look at the barriers as curious objects to figure out. And then when we figure it out and it begins to work, it becomes part of our know-how. There is a saying in another country I've worked in that goes something like this. How do you grow tomatoes in a desert? Well, you can do it. And the first step is you have to imagine tomatoes being grown in a desert. And of course, all of us, in whatever sort of discipline we work in, go from that imagination to concept. And connecting that is creativity, I believe. And then we start looking at that concept as a possibility. And of course, it's abstract. It's probably on a whiteboard. I put it on napkins, write them on napkins or on the wall of my house. I'll like put an idea down and then I'll start charting it out. And then I ask the question, can we enact this? And what's going to prevent us from enacting it? And in the phraseology of Kurt Lewin, the physicist, psychologist, we're working in a force field. And a force field are those factors that favor the project and move us towards success, and the restraining factors that prevent us from moving in that direction. And what do you do in a force field? You strengthen the positive factors, you try to weaken the restraining factors, and or eliminate the restraining factors. And then we get to a tipping point. Now, I'm just using this conceptually from the standpoint of almost like engineering in terms of finding a solution. I'm going to say something that's ridiculous. I welcome any barrier. Bring them on. Let's look at them. Let's figure them out. And then, you can imagine, I've seen this in kitchens, culinary kitchens, where you have everyone in a group in the kitchen getting oriented to the cooking for the evening or for the week. And the chef says, this is what we're facing. What's our strategy for the week? And we're strategists. So strategist means we can look at the overall field of civic engagement and start figuring out what barriers we want to take on and what barriers we want to leave for later or what barriers we just want to avoid. Now, coming back to motivation, it is very dispiriting when we all face barriers. But it's also very energizing when we deal with a couple that are sort of the low-hanging fruit barriers. So that's my response to that very good question. And I have to say that we come back to framing. So let me pose a question to everyone. How do we frame success in using our knowledge? Now, that's something you could carry with you and start asking yourself, how do I frame success in a situation that could be, and this is an inappropriate application of a word, but I think it's useful for me, particularly when there's considerable nihilism. Nothing will work. We're totally pessimistic about this happening. There's no solution. We give up. We yield to all these forces. And from my reading of academia, I don't see that happening. I see a lot of things happening when we make up our mind as a group that they're going to happen, but we're also pragmatic in saying we're going to stumble or hit things that we didn't anticipate. Hit the wall, as we say. I'm exhausted now, Dr. Tokas, from talking about that one question. But what's another one?
Yeah. So there are two people who are interested in, to know that could you elaborate further on civic know-how and on civic science that you, just spoke on a few minutes back. And there is another question that I was referring to, perhaps, is pointing out to the fact that how this idea of civic engagement turned to knowledge as practice, application, dissemination, and more so with the hardening of IPR laws internationally. And I could, somewhere related to the idea of folk knowledge as well that you were pointing out too. So one is, this is another one. And Dr. Das Gupta is, wanting to know that, this whole idea of civic engagement and what we have been reflecting on until now makes a lot of sense in the context of science and technology and the other applied science like fields. However, for those engaged in disciplines like history, it is more of a complex situation. I mean, this is something interesting, for me as well as a social scientist. So yes, over to you.
That's a great question. I'm smiling because I totally understand. And yet I've witnessed things that are just marvelous when it comes to, how a discipline uses its traditions and its frames and its methodologies in this sort of civic engagement context. The local history movement is a good testimony to approaching assets of a community and strengths of a community and inequities that a community has experienced in raising its consciousness about their own identity and what they want to preserve and what they want to address. So I have to say, I have always been surprised by the range of disciplines that find meaning in the application of their knowledge in a context of, let me call it a context of need. And that context of need is where know-how resides. We know how. We know how to do X because we're doing it and we're learning by doing it. So there's a strong element of experiential learning for everyone. And the folk knowledge aspect of it from my standpoint, and I don't mean to dismiss it. I'm not using it in a dismissive kind of way. I'm using it in an empowered kind of way, that people bring different forms of knowledge to bear on, let's say, on that community of need to create a know-how that belongs to them, belongs to that community. And joining then becomes a really interesting factor because you usually start with a small group and it emanates sort of out and people begin to join or observe or be on the periphery, but they still feel like they're involved in it. So there's a massing within a given community to sort of take action. And when people begin to volunteer what they have come to know, it's working. That's why I think the history example is really good, because from a folk knowledge standpoint, my experience is many people are historians. They describe, they have stories and narratives, they have events, they have kinship networks that take them into history, and they have explanations that more formal historians may not just have in terms of local knowledge and what has occurred. And I think the local history movement forms an exchange between that expands the possibility of lay knowledge. So now I have folk knowledge and sort of lay knowledge that informs a given kind of effort. The know-how piece, I feel, becomes encoded in a social learning kind of way. People who do it become, in a sense, local experts for having done it and are doing it. And there's a decision to make about whether you want to open that know-how to other people from outside the community, which we would call diffusion or dissemination. And let me offer you again, sort of a naive statement, but as academics, we're interested in the usability of our knowledge broadly, specifically and broadly. So what I have found in framing civic engagement in a community is to appreciate local relevance and then disciplinary significance. So you could say or just let me use a more politicized kind of statement. I'm pursuing local relevance and national significance. In other words, within my discipline, I want others to learn about what we're doing in the knowledge base of making that happen. So Tom's approach to rehabilitating soil is a scientific process, but it also interacts with a commercial aspect. And I do believe he has 4 or 5 patents that have come out of that in terms of ways of healing the soil, particularly removing the soil from where it's at and then taking it to a warehouse and rehabilitating it and then returning it. I don't quite understand the process, but the food the vegetables that grow from that soil they're not contaminated after the rehabilitation process. And he brought in an economist, to ask the question, is it worthwhile to do this? Or should we just abandon it? And of course, the cost-benefit analysis suggested he was right. So our disciplinary knowledge can interact with the know-how. And the know-how resonates, I believe, within the community in which you're engaged, because it becomes a source of inspiration that these are things we can do in partnership with professors who are coming into our community and asking for nothing other than to work with us to co-create, and it's not a commercial transaction. I have to sort of emphasize that. It's this sense of, in academia, that knowledge is free and needs to be freed. That's sort of the basis of dissemination and the publication of results and the scrutiny of those results. And then the interesting kind of question, how did you do that? How did you bring about that 30 apartment building, the 30 apartments, and why 30? Why not 40? And Heidi will say, I'll tell you why 30, because it's at human scale and everything is designed so people will interact in positive ways. And it sounds like a little bit too much social engineering, but when you learn to stay away from people's threats, it becomes very healing for people to be able to interact in predictable, trusting, productive kinds of ways. And then that know-how becomes a mixture. Oh, no, not a mixture. Let me use Dr. Tokas's term, the blending of folk knowledge, lay knowledge, technical knowledge, and scientific knowledge. We blend that into a form. And we stand back and we go, where'd this come from? Last time I spoke around this, I shared a little instance of a gentleman who had a child with a disability who redesigned his bike, the child's bike. So he could pedal the bike in the snow. And he changed the entire, structure of the bike, and then he added what we call fat tires, which tires are like that. And then he realized that people who can't, who don't want to use automobiles and still want to get around, can get around in the snow on these bikes. And it's become a public bike kind of thing. Almost like Amsterdam, where you could just borrow a bike and, and drive it or ride it to your next destination and leave it there for the next person who wants to ride it somewhere else. And he's always joking with me that he's in the public utility business, because the bikes could be a public utility. And he had to really do a lot of interactions with parents of children with disabilities to understand these decisions around the bike. So to me, that's another application of know-how, or produces know-how. How do we know? What do we know about doing this particular kind of a project? I'm sure, Dr. Tokas, I missed something in those several questions.
I don't think so. I mean, like, I've reflected on almost all of them, but yes, there is another aspect that Dr. Das Gupta, while she was, trying to ask that how, being a historian, it can be a complex situation to dwell with the idea of civic engagement, and she has further, elaborated that, in the context of constant dissemination of fake histories, because there's a social construction out there, social cultural construction, and as teachers and learners of professional history in academia, we've been trying to engage with this whole scenario. So how do you see, that in context, how do you see this idea? And there are a couple of more questions, and I'm really, really, really amazed to see, people are posting very meaningful questions. And another one says, what if a community isn't receptive? What if the community isn't receptive? Yeah. So, and there's another question which I will take later on. So for now, these two ideas.
Well, let me come back to the idea of, and we'll ask our colleague to see if she's comfortable with what I'm going to say. And that is the idea of good history, of sound history, of the science of history. This brings out the educator in me. That let's say we do have a local history project where we could all learn from our colleague what constitutes good history, and how to think about fake history, and how to be a more critical consumer of history, and how to be a lay historian. Those are invaluable forms of instruction. And I had a project in Oklahoma where we sustained a civic engagement project for 10 years. And I transferred it to another faculty member who lived in the actual community. And I was always surprised. And our basis was in this small community center where we would all gather, and there were invitations to everyone in this small community. If you wanted to share some food and talk about the project, come to this meeting. It was every Saturday. And we had technical lectures during the entire day. We operated for 10 hours on Saturdays. And people could love those technical lectures that were done in lay language about how do you do a photographic essay within a community? How do you use geographic positioning systems? How do you use census data in the community? And then at the end of the day, we would have this open discussion about how we were going to use these methods in our project. And this is an assumption I'm making, I assume people lust for knowledge, for information. I think they're open and receptive to it. I used another example last time of a friend of mine who is a specialist in Shakespearean theater, who has seminars for women who have left incarceration in New York City. And they read plays together, and he teaches them how to interpret the plays in relationship to their own lives. And he keeps telling me it's the most rewarding form of education he has engaged in his entire life. Primarily because the women are trying to make sense of what they've been through. And we all know incarceration is not good. And where you come from that leads to incarceration is very challenging. So that kind of sense making. So let me frame it. Let me frame a question. I'm not suggesting this to our colleague. I'm tempted, but I'm not going to suggest it. But under what, in civic engagement, what would a civic engagement project look like around good history that was locality based? In other words, people could get their arms around it and find new knowledge or new understanding of who they are in relationship to their community. There is another question about community.
Yeah.
Could you repeat that, Dr. Token?
Yeah, it was, what if the community isn't receptive to the idea of, civic engagement? And there was another question on civic science, partially, partly
Yes.
reflected on that.
Yes. I think the citizen science, the civic science is very exciting because it, and I think I'm making a whole bunch of assumptions, so forgive me. But I also think there's a scientific curiosity built into a lot of us. And some of us have been able to express it formally and others haven't. And the cool thing about citizen science is it opens up the field of inquiry to people who are not officially considered scientists. And they learn how to use scientific method and supplement the reach of a scientist. So there's a faculty member at the University of Alaska Anchorage who was deeply concerned about a spread of I forgot what the virus was. And it was embedded in scat, in moose scat. Scat, of course, is when an animal defecates and it sits on the ground. And she has created a core of citizen scientists, she's trained them to collect the scat and do preliminary analyses for her and enter the data into databases. And they're spread all over Alaska. And she now, rather than has like research assistants, she has 100 citizen scientists who work with her very closely. Some of them are children or young adult, I should say adolescents. Some are young adults. Some are retired people. Some are folks who feel like they want to get involved in something intellectually productive for themselves. And then and when I say a core, they're a core, C-O-R-P-S. And from my experience, there is sort of that kind of enthusiasm operating in, particularly in people who care about their own communities and want to get involved and want to be, and gain, and see relevance in that form of volunteerism. And they get skills and they get interests. And sometimes they start, no matter what their ages are, they start popping up in academic programs as students. Because then they get really interested. And they want to translate that into a new kind of learning experience. I'm slipping on the phrase community of interest.
It's receptive.
Oh, receptive.
What if the community isn't receptive with the idea?
Yeah. They are receptive or not receptive? They are.
If they are not?
If they are not. Well, that's an interesting question because I think it's important to be invited in. and that you have a group that's interested and willing to collaborate, wanting to collaborate. So in my own language, I would say there's an element of readiness and preparation. There's an element of receptivity, and there's an element of welcoming. It doesn't have to be the entire community. It can be a group, a significant group, that wants to do something that otherwise is not doing. And it could win the other elements of the community over, or it will stay like what I would call an enclave project, which is an enclave within a specific community. The example I gave in Oklahoma was a community that kicked me out twice. They told me not to come back. And I kept saying, why? And they said, because you're too positive about us. We have problems. We want you to focus on the problems. And in my frame of reference, and this sounds like I'm contradicting myself, I could be. In my language, I was trying to frame a positive kind of endeavor. And we got there. We got to the issues. One of the issues I think I had shared with you guys last time was that there was a trend of people coming into this community. It was not a defended community. It was very vulnerable. And they were dumping dogs, injured dogs that had been fighting dogs. And those dogs were in very bad shape. And they weren't really a threat to the community, but they were seen as a threat. And the citizens, many of the citizens wanted the sheriff department, the police department, to shoot the dogs, which they did. Until another group said, no, we can't do this. They have a right to be here. And I hosted a dialogue on whether we should shoot or nurture the dogs. 200 people showed up arguing their case. It was very, if you're aware of the model of adversarial evaluation, it was adversarial. We had one group for shooting the dogs, the other was against it. And we reconciled to this. If we could come back, our students could come back with models of how other communities have done this, have worked to nurture the dogs, the group that wanted them shot would consider it. And that formed a whole course in nurturing dogs. And actually it was more on rehabilitating dogs, from fighting dogs to family members. That was a long process. It resulted in a fantastic model in partnership with the prison. And we brought in veterinarians, and the veterinarians were really used, particularly the behavioral veterinarians, were very helpful in learning how to rehabilitate the dogs. And then I got to stay in the community. They didn't ask me to leave anymore. And we started keeping a curriculum vitae. This I would recommend. Not my curriculum vitae, but the civic engagement curriculum vitae that would identify all the projects, their outcomes, the knowledge that flowed from them, including publications, presentations, local dissemination, local presentations, all the events that coincided with the civic engagement project. There may be a different process for the community that's not receptive versus the community that's receptive. And so in your own process work, and if you're thinking about a particular community, and some communities are just defended, they don't want outsiders in them. that approach may be, and I think you have to have a good rationale for why you would want to insert yourself in a community that's not receptive. But if it can be done, I would encourage you to do it. It's just going to take a longer period of time. And often what I found, and this is maybe arrogant on my part, is that those communities that are not receptive have been let down by professionals, have been let down by institutions, are overwhelmed and in a state of distress that they don't want anyone coming in to make them more miserable.
Okay.
We are
Yeah.
closing in on 9 o'clock on my side. It's what, 11:30
Yeah.
on
Yeah.
your side?
It's almost 11:30. So there's
Okay.
So there's another question by Jobin Thomas. He says that the global parameters of assessment of academic institutions lays a disproportionate emphasis on reputations within a narrowly defined list of stakeholders. And so in this context, how do we take on this notion of civic engagement, which is not often relatable into measurable parameters of societal impact?
What a great question. That's the root. That's the root of the that to me, that's the institutional question. What is the name of what is the term you use for the chief academic officer? Is it the provost?
Yeah, in many universities it's that, or for academic branch, they are also named as Dean Academic Affairs.
Okay, so those kind of
varies
folks,
across
yeah,
the institutions.
yeah. That culture is here to stay, what our colleague is describing. It doesn't mean, however, there can't be an alternative culture, and I'm not trying to discount that first culture, that it is narrow, that it is very reputational, that it is status, and we have all sorts of measures around that. But at the same time, and this is true in the United States, that major research universities are embracing this other side. And it's sort of like balanced institutional development. And it's coming from two sources internally. What I would call the provost, which is the chief academic officer of the university. Well, it's coming from four directions. And if you can unify this and talk through it and create a connection between that first culture, it's coming from the chief academic officer. It's coming from the dean of graduate studies. It's coming from the vice president for research. And the tone is being set by the chancellor. It's being endorsed by the faculty senate. And then most of all, faculty leaders who are doing it are honored, are affirmed for doing it. I was almost going to say a new generation of faculty will come in who will tie a knot between those two cultures, the disciplinary culture and the civic engagement culture. They can live together. And the promising thing is this idea of appointments, the type of appointment. I've done a lot of research, but I've always acted as a public service faculty member. And I got away with it in research universities. I can't to this day figure out how I did it. And the professor of practice, those are growing in research universities. And they're growing for a simple reason, because you have those two cultures. I'm just, for lack of a better phrase, I'm calling it disciplinary culture, and then the civic engagement culture. And right smack in the middle is translatory science. If they work well, the best example should be a medical school that has basic science, has clinical education, and has clinical practice. And it's very interesting in the United States, you're seeing, and there's reasons for this, that sort of emanate from, you know, if you are aware of the hurricane in New Orleans called Katrina, that devastated New Orleans. Medical schools started looking at vulnerable neighborhoods because those vulnerable neighborhoods in New Orleans were wiped out. And the deaths, the mortality was among highly vulnerable people. Poor people with disabilities, elders, they were killed during that hurricane, and they shouldn't have been. There could have been much more prevention. And the, what's the name of the university in New Orleans, with a strong medical school, devolved their clinics and changed their residency programs and changed the incentive programs for faculty. So they were in clinics in high-risk neighborhoods. Now they know where those neighborhoods, they're using data to identify high-risk neighborhoods, and they have clinics, and then they did something radical. I think it's radical. They created residencies in community medicine. They reinvented community medicine. And they created residencies in those high-risk neighborhoods, focusing on the medicine of poverty, AKA social determinants, health disparities, the medicine of poverty. And I was thinking, if a medical school can do it, which is very hierarchical, you know? I mean the way, when I was at the medical school in Oklahoma, they didn't have any community clinics until an enlightened dean said, we got to get out in the community. And you'll like this story. No one would go with him. He said he was a public service physician. He was a psychiatrist. He was the dean of the medical school. So he got a bike. He had saddlebags on the bike. He filled the saddlebags with prescription medication, and he rode through high-risk neighborhoods, stop at corners, build relationships, do diagnostic work right on the corner. Then he would say, is there any way I could get an office somewhere in this neighborhood? And it usually ended up being at the city hall. And then he would fill that full of residents. And the faculty who were back at the specialized clinics in downtown Oklahoma City didn't like it, but it changed. Rather than being like this, the medical school is now like this. Has centers and clinics all around town in high-need communities. And they got so good, they created their own insurance program. So they self-insure people in those neighborhoods. I guess it's called institutional leadership. And then the faculty senate, if indeed you have that structure, but the collective of faculty who participate in the governance of the university, they're very instrumental in this. What I don't want to see happen is to marginalize the old culture. And I don't mean by old, that is problematic. That's good stuff. It's worked. It's useful. It's great. But it's not the only structure to have in a university. And it doesn't have to be competing structure. And this idea of translation, sits right in the middle. That's my hopeful response.
Thank you so much, sir. And indeed, it has been a very, very thought-provoking, interaction and reflection on the whole idea of civic engagement. I'm very glad that you could, touch upon the nuances of the idea of civic engagement. And as a sociologist, and for that matter, as an educator, one see the idea of praxis flowing in through this whole, theory, or for that matter, when we, lived experiences of individuals in our own social context are, being part of the very process, whether it is teaching, learning process, or for that matter, I'm reminded of the fact that, there was a point of time wherein, the idea of civic engagement or community engagement would only be, relegated to the departments like social work, or for that matter, people, engaging with actual research. But I think the contemporary time pandemic, ever since it has influenced each one of us in different ways, because we are located in different contexts, across the disciplines, across the cultures. So we have seen, though there is this idea of social distancing physically, as you were rightly mentioning, but mentally, if you talk about, we are all united collectively towards the idea of well-being for each other. So it's no more, one is just bothered about your own self, but one is bothered about the one in my neighborhood, in my community. And there have been, a lot of incidences that were reported in media, and perhaps, as academia, we must have also seen in our own spaces where we stay or where we, teach. I mean, that how people, collectively could come and, you could see, community engagement emerging of these very situation. And rightly, you pointed it out that barriers can be opportunity to get motivated, and opportunity for your own growth and for the well-being of others as well. And how beautifully, this all has come together, to the idea that, community engagement, or for that matter, blended learning also, if we want to talk about, it's a subject I would rather see that which is being determined by this context that you are located as an individual or as an academic, and it's learner-centric. And coming back to the idea of civic engagement, it's people-centric, well-being centric, right? So whether you talk about the idea of blended learning, or whether you talk about the idea of civic engagement and community engagement, it finds its expression in being more empathetic, having cultural humility, being more creative, imaginative, and being be considerate of lived experiences of people around you, and one can see the idea of happiness, being entwined to this idea of education, or and the idea of resilience also flowing in. And I'm very, very glad that we could have such a, engaging session. And in fact, I'm very, very thankful to each one of you who've, joined us from across the country for both the programs. And you've put across such wonderful questions,
Beautiful questions. I'm so excited by those questions.
Yeah.
May I say two things in parting, Dr. Tokas, is that Dr. R.R. Singh was my navigator when I was in India.
Professor R.R. Singh from Social Work Department of Delhi University. Yeah.
And his walking stride was way ahead of mine. And he was interacting with so many people around how they saw the quality of their life in the villages that him and I traveled through. And one of the most impressive things I've witnessed in my work when I was at Bhagatpur Singh Mahila University was the collaboration between engineering and social work.
Exactly, sir.
Just amazing.
I would like to share that, Professor Moxley and Professor R.R. Singh, have been very, very, have played significant role in, bringing about the center in our university where I belong to, BPS Mahila Vishwavidyalaya Sonipat. And we do have a, society community engagement center, which not only, engages our own students in research work, but we also have adopted, neighboring villages. And it's very interesting. I'm very, very glad that, we could have people like you and Professor Singh who've, really shown the way to an academic institution, and very glad. And so, on behalf of the Teaching Learning Center, Center of Ramanujan College, Principal Professor S.P. Agarwalji, and on the behalf of Program Director Dr. Nikhil Rajput, And also on the behalf of Program Director of our another FDP on blended learning, Professor Jagannath Chaudhary, who happens to be also head of Department of Pol Science at Delhi University, and also on the behalf of my fellow colleague here, who've made it further so enriching by their engaging questions, reflections, and observations. And we're very thankful to you, sir. And I would also want to share that, this whole idea of, faculty induction program, that Ramanujam College is currently organizing, how interestingly we, this whole program is being, co-organized with, universities from across the country. So including, in collaboration with Assam University, Silchar, Davangere University, Karnataka, Maharishi Markandeshwar University in Himachal Pradesh, Islamic University of Science and Technology, Jammu and Kashmir. So, it's indeed, perhaps, in the times when we are, looking for ways to move out of this pandemic, technology, of course, have been able to create these avenues that we could connect to each other. Perhaps, yes, it does have challenges. It does have, its own barriers, and people are being marginalized, whether it is about we from academic or for that matter, our learners. But I believe this academic spirit, this idea of community engagement takes us, and empowers us to be more humane to our, circumstances and to each other as well, carrying collectively the idea of well-being and happiness for each other. So perhaps.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much.
My heart to everyone. May our paths cross in the near future. And thank you so much for the invitation. I'm blessed.
Thank you so much, sir. I'm very glad, and I would like to share here that we next week as well on Saturday.
I will see you next week on January 30th.
Right.
Thank you so much, Doctor. And thank you, everyone. And thank you for your great questions.
Thank you so much.
Have a good morning or good afternoon, too. Bye-bye.
Good night, sir. Thank you so much.